This is a nice review paper that you should read if this topic is of interest to you at all, because I'm again going to be very brief, but I'm going to include it because it's important. And since I'm just making podcasts, I just pick topics subjectively and put a little introduction so that you can follow up if you're interested in the details. Obviously, a review article will have lots of citations as well. Climate change, human impacts, and coastal ecosystems in the Anthropocene. As you already know, Anthropocene is essentially the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There is geological definition being put behind it by looking at geologic records that are left behind from the beginning of this, because every time you name a geologic time scale, you have to show that it is geologically recorded. So there are lakes and so on where human impacts are being found as long-lasting geologic evidences. Coastal zones in the world's most densely populated regions are increasingly threatened by climate change stressors, which we have heard of in several podcasts that I already included. Rising and warming seas, intensifying storms and droughts, and acidifying oceans. Although coastal zones have been affected by local human activities for centuries, how local impacts and climate change stresses may interact to jeopardize coastal ecosystems remains poorly understood. That's very critical to remember. Humans have been affecting the coastal regions locally for a while now, and climate change is now superposing on that with rising sea levels, acidifying waters, cyclones, and so on. Okay. Here we provide a review on interactions between climate change and local human impacts. For example, interactions between sea level rise and anthropogenic land subsidence, which are forcing Indonesia to relocate its capital city in the coastal realm. So when you start withdrawing groundwaters at a very rapid rate, or you do other human activities like overloading the coastal regions with sediments and so on, then you can cause land subsidence or relative sea level rise. And Indonesia is a good example of that. So you have now local human activities superposing on global warming, or global warming superposing on local human activities. We highlight how these interactions can impair and at times decimate a variety of coastal ecosystems, and examine how understanding and incorporating these interactions can reshape theory on climate change impacts and ecological resilience. We further discuss implications of interactions between climate change and local human impacts for coastal conservation, and elucidate the context when and where local conservation is more likely to buffer the impacts of climate change, attempting to help reconcile the growing debate about whether to shift much of the investment in local conservation to global CO2 emissions reductions. Can we just have a tunnel vision on mitigation of CO2 and then achieve some of these goals at coastal levels? Our review underscores that an enhanced understanding of interactions between climate change and local human impacts is of profound importance to improving predictions of climate change impacts, devising climate-smart conservation actions, and helping enhance adaptation of coastal societies to climate change in the Anthropocene. So you have to just be careful about words adaptation being used separately or synonymously. Okay, this is a nice schematic here showing no climate change, low population density. So you have, let's say, a baseline system. We can even go to let's say pre-industrial times and call that a baseline, assuming the human impact was still minimal from the beginning of the agricultural society. And here we are looking at climate change, low population density. So we are changing CO2, so air temperature is increasing, precipitation changes happen, ice melt, sea level rise, thermal expansion, and then water temperatures and stratification changes happen, wind, waves and storms, and CO2 absorption and acidification happen. So you have just added physical climate change impacts onto various drivers of changes in the coastal ecosystems. And then you are taking climate change and adding high population density, which is what is happening. More and more people are moving into coastal regions. 50% lives within I think 50 miles, and this number is expected to continue to increase in the 21st century. So just track these numbers here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as well. So rising CO2, air temperature, then population density. So you have the same things, and then you are going to add fishing pressure here and various transportations, and you are going to add mining, dredging, various other things. So you can see these regions expanding here. So this is all a bit schematic. When you change land use in the coastal region like this, you're going to have pollution being shown here, for example, eutrophication, and so on as well. Okay. Maybe we should just read this, even though you get the sense. Impacts of climate change and local human activities on coastal ecosystems. In A, the scenario is when a system is not affected by climate change. In B scenario, when the system is pressured primarily by climate change. And C is when the system is pressured by both climate change and intense local human impacts. So you have climate warming promotes algal blooms, seaward loss and landward movement of coastal wetlands as a result of sea level rise. That is 2 here, so you can see how that's changing. And we have also mangrove replacement of salt marsh grasses as a result of climate warming. In the 3, we have warming driven replacement of temperate seagrasses by subtropical seagrasses and loss of bivalves due to ocean acidification. That's this here. You can see the change happening there. And invasion of tropical fishes into temperate coastal waters and changes in fish species abundance and composition with warming in 4. And 5, saltwater intrusion due to sea level rise into groundwater systems. In C, impacts of warming on algal blooms and hypoxia are exacerbated by eutrophication and loss of coastal wetlands due to compounding effects of sea level rise and sea reclamation for urban, industrial and agricultural expansion. In 3, you have seagrass, so you have separate numbering here again. Seagrass bivalve loss is exacerbated due to synergistic or additive interactions between warming, ocean acidification and eutrophication. And 4, you can merge together collapse of fisheries due to synergistic interactions between overfishing and warming. And again, 5, intense groundwater withdrawal exacerbates saltwater intrusion driven by sea level rise. Okay, they are kind of intuitive. You probably heard already these things, but it's good to kind of look at it in a kind of review paper. Major coastal ecosystems and their main climate change and local human impacts. References are given that you can follow up. I'm not going to read all these details, but ecosystems are looked at. Definition exists: climate change stressors, local human stressors. So you are taking global scale changes manifest locally as climate change stressors, because sea level rise and warming are local. Rising atmospheric CO2 is global, but climate extremes, droughts and storms are very local. Arabian Sea is different than the Bay of Bengal, for example. And the Indian Ocean is different than South China Sea and the Pacific, and so on and so forth. And local human stressors like pollutant input, biological invasion, coastal development, coastal engineering, nutrient input, sediment input, fishing, grazing, and so on. So salt marshes being affected, mangrove forests being affected, of course, seagrass beds, and soft sediments affected by warming, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and all the human activities. Okay, so little bit of overlap there, but it's good to keep all these things in mind. In addition, you have rocky shores, kelp forests, coral reefs, and oyster reefs. There are some regions which are very stark in these impacts. Chesapeake Bay is one, Mediterranean, Great Barrier Reef, kelp forests off of California, and so on and so forth. Okay, so climate change and local human stressors are based on reference 117. Those with a score of greater than 2 are considered here according to their classification. Additional stressors are added when needed according to reviews on a specific type of coastal ecosystems, for example, fishing, kelp harvesting, pollutant input, nutrient input for kelp forests, and for corals you have these various other things. So please go back and read the report if you want the details. Impacts of climate change on coastal ecosystems. Case studies are always important because all global warming is local and all impacts have regional and local specificities, so only case studies can tell you how many things are common, if there's a typography of a combination of climate change and human impacts that produce certain outcomes on ecosystems and so on. So here we review cases where climate change has been demonstrated to affect gene expression and cellular or whole organism physiology, population and community dynamics, and ecosystem functions and services in coastal ecosystems. These not only represent areas where scientific understanding is rapidly advancing, but are also areas of ecological or economic importance. Almost 90% of the fisheries are caught within 100 kilometer or so of the coasts, and this is where the exclusive economic zone ideas emerged by US leading it, and now everybody has a right to 200 kilometers or miles, you should check. But here, impacts on organism genes and physiology, case studies. Climate change can have strong impacts on gene expression and cellular and whole organism physiology. Heat stress, for example, has been found in both coastal animals and plants like seagrasses to upregulate genes that encode heat shock proteins. So when change is slow enough, or if the organism is able to respond fast, then it will express genetic adaptation. So you have to be careful. These terminologies are used by biologists and ecologists in different ways. A range of other physiological metabolic processes, including photosynthesis and respiration, increase with temperature within the range of species tolerance before the tolerance threshold is reached and acute thermal deaths occur. This explains in part the increased likelihood of phytoplankton blooms and disease outbreaks within ocean warming. For heterotrophic organisms such as salmon in the Pacific Northwest, increased respiratory rates in warmer waters can lead to energy demand exceeding energy intake, reducing their aerobic scope for activity and their growth and reproduction. So we are going from environmental parameters into physiological changes and response of the species that can keep up or may end up harming the species, like in the case of salmon. Okay, so there are other examples. Rising sea levels can increase inundation stress, reducing the photosynthesis and growth of salt marsh grasses and mangroves on their seaward edge. Ocean acidification is thought to increase the energetic cost of calcification and deplete carbonate ions, reducing calcification in most calcifiers except for some crustaceans, including commercially valuable shellfish and habitat-forming species such as oysters and corals. So we're only looking at the impacts, but there are also feedbacks. If you decimate mangroves, carbon sequestration in the coastal waters or blue carbon is reduced, so you will increase CO2 again and have a feedback. If you harm the calcifiers, food web can get destroyed or perturbed seriously. So there are all kinds of feedbacks that are also very important. The second example of case study is reshuffling and shifting of tropical temperature and polar communities. Reshuffling and shifting coastal marine communities with climate change have been increasingly documented. Mangroves, for example, are replacing their temperate analogs. Salt marshes, tropical seagrasses are expanding and replacing temperate seagrasses. Invasive lionfish are increasingly found in temperate waters, and tropical herbivorous reef fishes are intruding and at times decimating temperate kelp forests, leading to tropicalization of temperate zones. Some of these processes are depicted in figure 1b that we just saw. Similarly, boreal fish communities are expanding into the Arctic, leading to borealization of polar zones. This is also called Atlanticization of the Arctic. Okay, so you can read the rest of the text there. I'm just giving you a flavor. Alteration in ecosystem function and services. Mangrove encroachment in salt marshes under warming, for example, can promote wetland carbon stock. Sea level rise may increase the latent extent of coastal wetlands, and enhance their carbon stock, especially in areas where wetland landward movement is not blocked by human infrastructure. So we are talking about co-benefits that are unintentional, and this is how biology tends to work. We always say nature makes the rules and biology finds the loopholes. So you create refugia where ecosystems can survive by beating the warming, acidification and other things. There are corals which thrive by changing their relation with their symbionts or take up more heat tolerant symbionts, and there is now new evidence that corals can survive in very low nutrient waters by harvesting symbiont algae. So they literally grow them, agriculture being done by corals to produce food for themselves by growing symbiont algae that they can consume to survive in low nutrient waters. So sea level rise, however, has also been found to reduce production, nitrogen sequestration and denitrification functions of tidal marshes. Denitrification is a process where nitrate is split to produce oxygen by organisms that want to live in low oxygen waters and so on. Okay, drought, heat and storm driven die-offs of salt marshes, mangroves and coral reefs reduce the coastal protection services in those coastal protection ecosystem services that those ecosystems provide. Okay, another nice schematic here. So we are looking at healthy state, and climate change is increasing this direction to degrade the state. So you can see healthy corals, and climate change and local human stressors are warming the waters and also creating nutrient eutrophication. So nitrogen to phosphorus ratios can change, which changes the species composition of what kind of phytoplankton and zooplankton grow. So you see the color changes here, and this is looking almost devoid of any life in terms of the colors, photosynthesizers and so on. So this is the degraded state. You have something like a kelp forest which is in a healthy state. Then you are increasing temperatures, adding fishing pressure and beginning to alter the abundance, species abundance, and then you have fishing pressure continue even as the kelp forest is beginning to disappear and not able to provide the habitat in terms of nutrient recycling, producing photosynthetic organic matter and oxygen, and ending up with a degraded state. We are of course acidifying the waters quite a bit. So in the healthy state you have a pH that is suitable for many of the organisms that live there. By decreasing the pH and increasing the altering the N to P ratios and decreasing oxygen in addition to acidifying waters, we are ending up with a degraded system. So empirically tested synergistic interactions between climate change and local human impacts in a variety of coastal ecosystems. Okay, as examples, warming and eutrophication in coral reefs, warming and overfishing in kelp forest, ocean acidification and hypoxia on hard clams in soft sediments. Next we are going to look at warming and heavy metal pollution on oyster reefs, drought and overfishing in salt marshes. These illustrations are mainly to exemplify some of the climate change and local human stressors that have been demonstrated to interact to cause coastal ecosystem degradation. These climate change and local human stressors may take effect at different timescales, so you have to see the main text for details. So here we have the heavy metal and pollution on oyster reef with the degraded state here, going from a healthy state, degrading state to degraded state. So this is cadmium here as a heavy metal pollutant, and you have salt marshes here, drought and overfishing affecting seriously salt marshes and creating basically barren salinated soil with no life. Okay, so looking at empirical data showing variations in local human impacts and climate change impacts along population density gradients. I won't read all these details, but we are looking at nitrogen export. So this scale here is population in persons per square kilometer. So we are looking at nitrogen export in kilogram nitrogen per meter squared per year. The fluxes increasing non-linearly with population density, and land subsidence increasing as well in centimeters per year, giving you relative sea level rise, salt inundation of groundwaters, decimation of wetlands and mangrove decimation and so on. Impervious area, percentage of total land area increasing with population, but that tends to saturate. And you have saltwater intrusions into coarse-grained clastic rocks, carbonate rocks, and coarse-grained unconsolidated sediment. So those are different types of impacts based on what is the background material. Here you have relative abundance of parrotfish, so coral predators and grazers crashing with population density in persons per square kilometers, and a more linear drop in pH, with freshwater buffering being weak and strong. So if it is strong, then pH can be maintained with population density increasing, but if the buffering ability of the freshwater is weak. What is buffering? Basically, very briefly, I have podcasts on this elsewhere. In waters, especially with brackish or salt water, alkalinity water, when CO2 dissolves, H2CO3 or carbonic acid forms, that is split into bicarbonate and bicarbonate, so that the CO2 increase doesn't immediately affect pH. But for that you need strong buffering. But if you have a weak buffering, you can see that population density increases tends to crash the pH to levels where ecosystems cannot function. This is conceptual models of climate change impacts as a function of human population density again. So population density here, impact severity can be extreme. So if you have low population density, you can have a certain tipping point and you can stay safely below it. So we are looking at various color codes here. Variation in synergistic, additive and antagonistic interactions between climate change and local human impacts. Also shown is how magnitude of climate stress, low, high and extreme. So those are the climate stresses. And so synergistic, additive and antagonistic. So impact severity can decrease if the impacts are antagonistic, but if they're additive, then you can accelerate. As population density increases, the climate impact can cross tipping points even when the impact is low. For example, you can see that a low impact with local impacts can add and cross the tipping points. These are schematics, so just keep them in mind. And this is the ecosystem or species cover. What remains with population density, what is lost to climate change, and how local lost to local impact. So you can have compounding effect of climate change adding to continued local impact. There may be a local fisheries that is going on, let's say off Mumbai coast. Sea level rise comes along, pollution comes along, acidification comes along, and cyclones come along, and soon you have global impacts with their local manifestations adding to local impacts and basically decimating the fisheries. Okay, more schematics here. Local stress vulnerability low to high, climate vulnerability low to high. So you can have various potential outcomes. I won't go into the details. So you have random response, positive co-tolerance, negative co-tolerance. So you have situation where there are no stressors. You have climate stressor here, you have local stressor here, and you have both stressors, both stress. So this is the climate stressor, these are both stressors. So as climate vulnerability increases and local stress vulnerability increases, you may end up in this quadrant, which is very high vulnerability to climate and local stresses, and that's bad news, of course. And fishing vulnerability for corals and fishes, you can see as climate vulnerability and local impacts can merge, and you can end up in this with high vulnerability for fish and to climate, and somewhere here where fishing vulnerability is low but climate vulnerability is high. kind of phase spaces that you can look at. Some more about the solutions. So local conservation promotes resilience and restoration under climate change. So these are marine protected areas which are argued to enhance stability. So this is years here and species richness. So if you have marine protected areas, you can not only maintain but sometimes increase species richness and also have impacts outside the marine protected area. So if you protect this area, the impact of protecting species here begins to impact positively the areas outside the MPA as well, and that's kind of what is implied here in terms of open ocean protected areas, where your protection over time can build species richness, and then other factors like continued warming or acidification can have some effects as well. Similarly, nutrient reduction leads to recovery. So nitrogen and subaquatic vegetation cover here. This is survival of restored coral of a particular type. So genotype affects restoration trajectory. So some are able to handle heat stress better. So survival of restored coral can depend on the genotype, which particular coral it is. Some are doing fine through the heat stress, some are doing less well, and some are basically crashing even after restoring the coral. Similarly, increases in community thermal affinity in degrees C per decade with the warming. So open marine protected areas provide resistance to tropicalization. This is the expansion of species like mangroves into salt marshes and so on. So in the open ocean versus marine protected areas. So we should be careful. This is where you have variability appearing, and here where you are conserving the region with protection. So increases in thermal affinity. So the genetic response or genetic adaptation can depend on how you are experiencing climate change locally. Mortality rates, I won't go through the details. Baseline, example from North Carolina, Chesapeake Bay, and no empirical evidence. So these are additive, synergy, and antagonistic confluence of climate change and local impacts. I mentioned Chesapeake Bay before, and you can see that North Carolina is experiencing much more of the additive impacts. Synergistic impacts are affecting Chesapeake Bay, and there are regions of antagonistic interactions, but no empirical evidence is reported here. Changes in cover of restored seagrass. Again, I won't go into the details, but it is species richness being shown here with diversity promoting restoration with stress. Okay. Sorry, I'm running through it because I meant it to be brief, and the paper is very nice, and you definitely should read it if this is of interest for you in terms of more details. They have several recommendations. I will read the one on how coastal management has to evolve. Global climate change is accelerating at high rates and pressuring all of Earth's ecosystems, including those on coasts, especially those on coasts. Mitigating the impacts of climate change on coastal ecosystems, however, is particularly challenging because of interactions with local human impacts that are intense in densely populated coasts, and coasts are becoming increasingly densely populated. Coastal management strategies need to consider those interactions to optimize performance. Another challenge for coastal management is that climate change and human impacts are constantly changing. Thus, an adaptive, evolving management strategy is required. Adaptive management is always critical. It has to make plans, develop strategies, find funding, and then evolve based on the outcomes. A prototype of such evolving coastal management might be 2,000 years of coastal adaptation to encroaching seas in Netherlands, which has evolved from coastal armament, walling off of estuaries, to currently giving land back to the sea, restoring and creating coastal ecosystems as natural, sustainable flood defenses. Netherlands has reduced the flood risk almost to zero and has informed people and firms about what residual risk they are not protected against and how they have to protect themselves with insurance and other tools. but this is possible for small rich country and not possible for everybody. The Dutch approach, however, does not necessarily transfer to other coasts. In developing coastal regions, countries' adaptation capacity, they keep using adaptation, but actually it's adaptation, can be severely limited by socioeconomic and technical constraints. Coastal societies will have to develop innovative coastal management strategies appropriate for their socioeconomic status and ecosystem condition, potentially including community-based fisheries management and ecosystem-based management, an integrated management approach that considers all types of interactions within an ecosystem as well, such as climate change, human impacts, and stakeholders. It's possible that rich countries will begin to protect coastlines of poor countries if they are able to serve good fish for them. Very fish-dominated diet of Japan will probably make it worry about fisheries elsewhere. So that's what we have to watch out for in terms of how, considering climate changes created by the rich countries in terms of accumulated carbon since industrial revolution, how will we deal with local impacts that is not yours but somebody else's? Other innovative coastal management strategies may emerge with advances in ecological understanding of coastal processes and in technologies such as genetic modification, remote sensing, and telecommunication. Impact of climate change on coastal ecosystems in the Anthropocene simply cannot be understood and managed as constant and in isolation. Understanding interactions between climate change and local human impacts has profound and far-reaching implications for future of coastal ecosystems and civilizations along the increasingly human populated coasts. I should mention here again that fisheries that you are catching off your coast is not completely living and evolving there through the life cycle. It may be spawning elsewhere and coming to your coast when it's an adult or breeding, and something that's happening in the spawning ground may affect your fisheries. So we have to see that all these habitats are interconnected and they're connected to the open ocean as well. So it just comes down to managing the whole ecosystem with natural solutions, ecosystem based approaches, and global cooperation. So under the UN Decade of Ocean Sciences, which is going on now, these things have to be considered for sustainable exploitation of marine resources and freshwater resources, which is one of the sustainable development goals as well. This has become an incredibly long podcast of 32 minutes, which I usually don't do, but I wanted to complete this one by itself, so I will leave it as a long podcast. Okay.